about the REPS regulations that were recently adopted by the Rental Housing Committee. Let's go through the presentation first, and if you can keep your questions until the end of the presentation, and then we have ample time to answer any of your questions that you have. Let's get started. So just a little bit of background for those of you that did not attend Rental Housing Committee meetings. The REPS utility charges were separately charged from rent in quite a few properties in Mountain View. And these REPS charges every month were fluctuating. So the Rental Housing Committee and staff received inquiries from tenants if that was allowable under the CSFRA, our Rent Stabilization Charter in Mountain View. And legal reviewed that question and did a study session to the Rental Housing Committee, stating that the definitions in the CSFRA state that utilities should be part of the rent and should be treated like that. So because utilities are considered part of rent, they are subject to the limitations on rent increases, which means under the CSFRA, you can only increase the rent once every 2 months, and the rent increase cannot be more than the annual general adjustment of rent. So these new regulations that have been adopted by the Rental Housing Committee now clarify that it should be a fixed monthly costs for tenants, increasing tenant stability, and separate REPS charges are prohibited going forward. And there is also a one-time petition adjustment process for landlords to be able to include previously separately charged utilities into the rent amount for tenants. And we also got regulated that tenants' petitions for utility issues are paused during this adjustment process. A little bit of background on the timeline. As you can see, a first study session was held in January of 2023. And at that meeting, the Rental Housing Committee asked for stakeholder outreach, which we did. In February and March of 2023, there were landlord stakeholder meetings, tenant stakeholder meetings, and then a general stakeholder meeting to summarize everything that we heard and to request any further input if there was any more. So then we brought all of those conclusions back to the Rental Housing Committee in August. 4 of the 5 Rental Housing Committee members were new at the time, so we recapped what we found in our January Rental Housing Committee meeting, and then we added all the conclusions out of the stakeholder meetings. So the Rental Housing Committee said, yes, we want to move forward. Can you see what potential regulations would look like and what we should be able to include? So there was another study session in October of 2023, and eventually in December, the Rental Housing the regulations that you can now find on our website.
Can you talk a little louder?
Hmm?
Talk a little louder.
Okay. Where is the microphone?
Oh, it's up right here.
From the computer. Let me go stand over here. So in these regulations, it states that for new tenancies starting tomorrow, REPS is no longer allowed. What does that mean for the landlords? You have to cover all your utility costs that come through you, whether directly or indirectly through Conservice. Those need to be part of the rent amount that's in your rental agreement. The only exemptions are that individually metered units are exempt from this regulation. So if your tenants have a direct account with PG&E, for instance, that can stay as it is. Those are separately metered utility costs. The rental agreement also needs to state the type of utilities that are included in the rent. For instance, if the tenant only has a separate PG&E account, direct account with PG&E, but all the other housing services and utilities come through or via the landlord, all those need to be stated in your rental agreement. The rent includes, for instance, water, garbage, sewer, pet fee, parking space, whatever else that you separately charge for to the tenant now needs to be included in that rent. So what happens to existing tenants? The RUBS can continue to be used until a landlord goes through the petition process that we designed specifically for this transition period in time. And what you do is you add the utility charges into the rent by making certain calculations and what a reasonable amount of utility charges would be feasible to include that in the rent. And that adjustment is based on the number of rooms in the unit, a common area deduction, and the Santa Clara County Housing Authority utility allowances. And we'll go in more detail on how that calculation is made. And staff is currently developing a form that you can use so it's easy for you to follow the steps. So here's a little more detail on how these calculations will happen. This petition process hopefully will be published in the second half of this year. But this is like a little preview for you to understand. And in the meantime, you can continue to use RUBS. So we try to parse it out step by step. So for instance, for water, we take the total water bill for the previous 12 months. And then we determine the common area deduction percentage in step 2. And the formula for that is, it is a standard 10%. If you have a pool and a landscaping and a laundry facilities, you add for each 5%. And that is what is deducted from the total water bill. There's an example on the right of this slide. For instance, if total water charges for a 10 2-bedroom unit is $15,000, and we determine that the common area deduction is 20% because we have the 10% standard and we have a pool and landscaping but no laundry. So the 20% of that 15,000 is 3,000, and we deduct that. You have a remainder of $12,000. Then you determine the monthly charges from this annual amount, which is $1,000 per month. If it's 12,000 per year, the monthly cost is $1,000 per month. And then we have to determine the total number of rooms on the property. So in our example, we have 10 2-bedroom units. And the way we calculate rooms is laid out in step 4. Looking at the 2-bedroom units, it has a kitchen, a living room, and 2 bedrooms, which is a total of 4 rooms. So the total number of rooms in your property is 10 times 4 is 40 rooms. And next slide. So then we calculate the allowable monthly water charge per room is divide that $1,000 by 40. So you come out to $25 per room. And then how much is that per unit? It's 4 rooms. So the monthly charge per unit is 4 times 25 is 100. So in this example, it's a little simple, but if you have different unit rentals in one property, this is the common way you can determine the per room cost first, and then it's easier to calculate what is practical for each unit. And then as a last step, you have to look at the Santa Clara County Housing Authority allowance. I put some copies on the table. And when we look at a 2-bedroom water charges, allowed charges, that is $79. So you can add to the rent this $79 for the water, not the $100, because that one is the lower of the two calculations.
Is that this handout right here?
Yeah.
Whichever is the lowest.
Yeah. So this is just a random example that I gave with made up numbers.
Well, I'm trying to find out where that 79% or something, or
$79. So first you look, the unit type is low rise and high rise, right? And then you look for water. And then you look at a 2-bedroom here.
okay, because in the example you had was 2-bedroom apartment.
Yeah.
Like there were 4 rooms in a 2-bedroom
Yeah.
apartment because you're counting the other.
Yeah, but this says 2 bedrooms. It doesn't say 4 rooms.
Right.
It's 2 bedrooms.
So you're using a different system of counting rooms.
That's just for the calculation, a one-time calculation.
That's the Mountain View system, and this is the Santa Clara system.
Yes.
So we're going to use the Mountain View system and the Santa Clara system, and then whichever one is lower with that.
Correct.
Okay.
And that's only for the water. How about for the sewer and the trash?
So you do the same exercise for all these different property bills that you're getting. If your water, sewer, and trash is all combined into one property, you can use that as the total and start step 1 with that total bill.
So, okay. So let's say, for example, our wastewater is $79 for the 2-bedroom.
And then you add the trash, and then you add the sewer. Yeah.
Got it.
Mm-hmm. So when the landlord petition filing is started, the release date is probably in the second half of this year. We're working hard to get all the forms and materials ready. There are some deadlines for which you have to comply to submit that petition. And the timeframes are, if you're a smaller property under 20 units, if you're smaller units between 1 and 5, you have to file that petition within 12 months of the release of that petition process. If you're between 6 and 20 units, you have to file within 9 months. And if you're a bigger property, you have to file within 6 months. I also wanted to go over the petition process so you get kind of a feel of what it is going to look like. Each of these steps will be incorporated in a form. So it's not like you have to figure it out all by yourself. We're trying to guide you every step of the way. But here's a first overview of what the petition process looks like. So the first step is that you do have to file a petition form as supplied by the city. And you have to add certain documents. The one is a list of all the units on the property, and for each rental unit, whether it's occupied or vacant, the number of rooms for each unit, like we just gave you an example of, and the start of the tenancy date and what the initial rent is, and then the amount and date of the most rent increase and current rent. And since for these calculations, we are using the master property billing for each of your utility services, you need to put in a copy, say, of your water bill over the last 12 months, the one that you're using to make those calculations. And if you decide what your common area deduction is, some supporting documentation, like we have no pool, but we do have landscaping, or we have no landscaping. This is the picture of what my property looks like. staff will review that petition package and determines whether it's complete, going off of the list in step 2. And if incomplete, we'll inform the landlord certain things are missing and you can make the necessary revisions before the filing deadline. If complete, we send a notice of acceptance to the landlord and affected tenants. The tenants have a right to respond within 30 days of that first notice if they don't agree with the calculations of the landlord. So once that is received or there was no response, the staff will review the petition, the additional documents, and the tenant's responses. We're not making the recalculate all the calculations for each property. So we do for properties with up to 5 units, but then for bigger units like 6 and more, we do a 20% random sample in your calculations. And if there are tenant responses, we will review the tenant unit calculations plus 15% sample, random sample. We can always ask for additional documentations, and then we make a determination whether the calculated utility adjustments as submitted by the landlord were correct and send a notice of confirmation to both the landlords and the tenants. And if there are incorrectly calculations, we send a notice of correction. This is a one-time process, and these determinations are not appealable to the rental housing committee. So if these petition process calculations are confirmed, a landlord can add in the utility adjustment amount with the next annual allowed rent increase.
So, question? No, I have a question.
Okay, go back one slide.
No, so regarding the spreadsheet that you guys will be asking from the landlord, so you will list all of the units, right?
Yeah.
Whether you occupy or vacant?
Yeah.
Okay. Question is, do we also have to provide information about those units that moved in March 1st that are not part of this petition process?
Yes.
Because those,
You just put them in there, and then we just know that they're there.
oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
That's a good point, and we'll finesse our next presentation adding that information. Yeah. So when are you allowed to add and make the switch from rent and RUBS to this rent only with the petition adjustment, utility adjustment? You can do that with the next annually allowed rent increase. So how do you do that? When you're about to give your annual rent increase, you first take the AGA percentage on top of the existing rent, and then you add that allowed utility adjustment on top of that. And that's then going to be the rent for that year, the total rent. So the rental housing committee decided that there are no tenant hardship petitions allowed for this utility adjustment portion of the rent increase. And we have to all be patient. This process will take some time, but we hope we can work through it by next year. So what happens if a landlord does not file a petition within the deadlines? They forego this one-time ability to add a utility adjustment amount to the rent, and also can no longer separately charge for utilities. So the rent amount is automatically assumed to include utility charges, and tenants can file unlawful petitions with the city to recover any overpayment due to works done. So that is, in short, a quick overview of what the Rental Housing Committee has adopted. Happy to answer, allow some time for questions.
I do have a question. So let's say, for example, a current tenant, they want to renew another 12-month lease.
That's an existing tenant,
Existing tenant.
and you have to follow this petition.
That's right. Okay. Yeah. That's right. Okay, thank you.
Are there any questions online?
Yeah, I guess.
Oh, here, one more question.
I have actually three, RUBS. What does that stand for?
Ratio utility billing systems. For instance, a landlord contracts with Conservice or another third-party billing provider.
I wanted to understand. You said ratio?
Ratio utility billing system.
The ratio utility billing system.
So some landlords already have the utilities included as part of rent, and those landlords do not have to change anything. They are already complying with how the system will be set up. But if you charge separate utilities on a fluctuating monthly basis, you have to go through this process.
Okay, and then, so ratio utility billing system, is that something that's been developed by the city of Mountain View?
Oh, no, that's something that the landlords use.
So for example, if I have, tenants who are, on the same electric meter, and then I'm supposed to, like, I will charge each of them for their electricity usage, like a third each, let's say something like that. If I had 3 tenants on one meter, or 4 tenants on one, I would charge each of them a quarter. Is that what people are doing?
People then hand that over to a third party and they will put in whatever formula you tell them to use. And then they charge the tenants separately monthly for the utility charges.
Is that what you guys do? So you don't do the calculation yourself?
So let me go to any questions online. Have we made any mistakes with the common area deductions? I will have to double check that. Sorry if I made a mistake, but I will definitely double check that and correct that in the next workshop. Would you have to use the $79 for all the units in a building that are participating in HUD? I'm not sure how HUD is related to this question, so that is hard to answer. Maybe you can clarify. Why would you not give larger properties with more than 20 units more time, up to a year, to get the petitions filed? Those were all decision moments within the rental housing committee, and they decided to adopt the schedule for 6 months for the larger units. And what is the petition for again? It's a utility adjustment petition when we switch from separately charged utilities that fluctuate on a monthly basis to a system where utilities are included in the rent and cannot fluctuate from month to month. Will this be something that we will be able to complete or submit through the portal? No, you will receive an online on our website. You can find the forms once they're ready, and you can submit the forms and documents by email or regular mail. Okay, that goes away. Does that mean that the rent increase forms will be changing to add the utility adjustments? That's correct. Hello, confirming as of March, no RUBS charges going forward. Only for new tenancies. For existing tenancies, we will go through an adjustment petition process starting in the second half of this year. You mentioned adding pet rent into the total rent. Correct. Any housing services or other utility charges that come from the landlord now need to be included in the total rent amount, and in the lease agreement, you state what services and utilities are included in the rent. So the immediate action item is that leases signed starting tomorrow need to include all utilities. Leases for new tenants. So if you're renewing leases for existing tenants, you have to go through the adjustment petition process coming in the second half of this year. For the rent adjustment, the AJA is 9.2% currently. I don't know where you get that number. I do not know where you get the 9.2.
Is not in, I think that's in Sunnyvale or other rent control cities.
Okay, 9.2 is not what is in the city of Mountain View. This year's allowed rent increase is 5%. Why would smaller properties be given more time than larger properties?
That's my question also, because.
I can explain that.
Please.
This was the thought behind it, just explaining the rationale that smaller landlords need more time to figure out how the system works. We usually give them a lot of help while filling out, even the database, even using the right forms. So we will be doing a lot of handholding with the smaller landlords to fill out everything correctly.
So that's why it was reversed. Okay.
Yeah, see, reverse to me. I had a question though, for some of these larger landlords, I just have a few units, but some of these people may have 20 or hundreds of units. The paperwork's not available yet. For them to
Well,
fill
they
it out.
don't also now don't need to do that yet. It's going to be the half.
Right, but they've got like a 6-month deadline.
Yeah.
For papers that they don't, did that deadline start after the papers are available?
Yes.
Oh, it doesn't start now, it starts
No.
after the papers.
The
They do
deadline
Yeah.
start after the petition forms
Become available.
become available in the second half of this year.
I will go, there was just
Can
like.
I maybe address these first, and then we'll go back into the room. How can we handle the increased usage if there is no consequence to overuse, a concern given eco concerns and constraints? That argument has been brought up in all the study sessions and the stakeholder meetings, and they have been submitted to the Rental Housing Committee, and they deliberated over those, and they found that the system that they developed currently in the regulations is the best of two worlds. So all tenants will continue RUBS until the petition has been approved, and then upon renewal, we will add the utility adjustment. Yes, all existing tenants will continue with the RUBS. New tenants, you have to start immediately with including everything in the rent. Could you repeat the gentleman's question? Well, there were lots of questions, so sorry, I will repeat the question next time. What if someone moves in, then decides to get a pet after 2 months? Can we adjust the monthly rent to include the pet fee starting at that time? So yes, there is a process for that as well. It's called a joint petition request that has to be filed with the city, that both the tenant and the landlord agree that the rent will be increased with a pet fee. Okay, we already answered the smaller properties timeline. So yes, so some utilities that are charged by the city, such as water, sewer, and trash, might increase their utilities rates on a different timeline than when you are able to give your rent increases. So those might not synchronize. That's correct. Again, you say it's for existing tenants. Is this only for tenants that are being charged utilities monthly? So if existing tenants already have in their rent agreement a fixed amount for rent, and that already includes all the utilities and fees, then you don't have to do anything. You can continue doing what you're doing. But if they are charged separately, besides the rent amount, for utilities, for a pet fee, for any type of housing services, that process will apply to those instances.
We have 23 Q&A right now, 2 raised hands. We have 23 more Q&A questions and 2 people with hands raised.
Shall we, what is the rationale for the CAD of 10%? Looking in the market right now, seeing what Conservice uses as a general common area deduction, and seeing what other companies are doing, this would seem to be the average of a reasonably accepted percentage. Yes, you can have a copy of the slides. If you leave your email address, we will send you a copy. I don't know yet whether the CAD is 5% or 10%. I will look that up once I get back in the office and correct this PowerPoint slides when that is needed, and then send the corrected version to everyone.
Oh, okay, so this percentage will be coming from the city. It's not coming from the landlord.
What part?
The CAD for, for the common area deduction
No, it
percentage.
says it says 10%.
That's right.
And someone says, wasn't it 5% in the latest regulation? And I have to look that up again, and I will let everybody know what it is. Okay. How can we handle the increased usage if there is no consequence to overuse? Okay, that question we just answered. What month do you estimate the petition process to begin? We are gunning for July, August, and that is in the planning right now. So by that time, the petition forms, etc., will be released. What qualifies as supporting documentation for a number of rooms? Would a rent roll qualify? We will include that in the petition forms. Right now, I don't have an answer to that. If we are a larger community with only about 20% with washer and dryer inside the unit, how should the water bill be calculated versus non-washer and dryer apartments? Okay, and there might be another misconception. So you add to the common area deduction when you have general use washer and dryer facilities. But if each washer and dryer is in separate units, that is not common area deduction. If a tenant has been here for a year and has been paying RUBS, but now wants to renew and we add RUBS into their rent, no. Existing tenants have to go through the petition process. If you renew the lease before the petition process gets published, you keep the rent and the RUBS the way you do business as usual. Only for new tenancies, new tenants moving into the apartment, you include all the utilities and housing services in the rent. Are we able to add an addendum in the lease that states what is included in the rent, or does it have to be in the lease? It has to be in the lease, and you have to state what is included in the rent. Not what is excluded from the rent, what is included in the rent. I'd like to know if someone moves in, decides to get it, okay, we have already done that. What about tenants who move month to month on March 1? No. If they move in on March 1, all the utilities and housing services are included in the rent. It doesn't matter whether it's a 1-year lease or a month-to-month rental agreement. They have to abide by the new system. Will there be an opportunity to adjust our utility amount annually since the utilities change? No. This adjustment petition is a one-time petition. Now, after that petition has been approved, it is now part of the rent amount, and each year you will be allowed to increase that with the annual general adjustment. The AGA for this year is 5%. It will be different for next year, depending on the CPI. Can you please repeat how the increased usage would be addressed? Would we have to file another petition? No, this is a one-time adjustment. And you can increase the rent, utilities are now part of rent, once a year with the annual general adjustment. If it turns out that your property feels there is no reasonable return on investment because the utilities might have increased so much that your capital investment is going down, you can file an MNOI petition, which is a maintenance of net operating income petition, which is a separate workshop if you're interested in that. What would the process be like if we decide to submeter our property at a later date? Can this easily be switched over? So when you decide to build in submeters, you can then, because then there's a direct account and usage calculation for each tenant, and they're being charged as to what they're actually using, you can switch that over and charge them what is shown on the submeter and take a reasonable deduction from the rent because you're no longer generally charging that utility, but you're basing it on the submeter. Outside of the pool, laundry, landscaping, there is no common area deduction water usage. We will need to include it. Yes. Why the sudden changes and implementation? As I mentioned in the beginning of our presentation, tenants and landlords were coming to the Rental Housing Committee and to staff with questions about how utilities can be charged. Tenants were experiencing month-to-month fluctuations, and they were wondering if that was allowed under the CSFRA, and a legal analysis decided that it was not allowed under the law. So we had to clarify this section so everybody understands better what is and what is not allowed under the law. Will the calculations be the last 12 months from the petition start? Yes, you cannot start calculating that now. I would advise you to take the 12 months from the start of your petition so you have the latest numbers that you can work with. If residents are renting additional storage units on site or parking spaces, would these also have to be included in the rent? You start out with an initial lease agreement with a total rent amount, and you state what housing services are included. If further down in the year they want to add, just like a pet fee, all of a sudden they want a pet, or they want to have extra garage spaces, you and the tenant can file a joint petition with the city to increase the rent, and the process for that is also included in our regulations. Will there be a CAA addendum form to add to the lease? Well, I don't know what the CAA is doing, so I cannot give you an answer to that. What would the,
Oh, we did
okay,
that
I have
already.
that one already. Do we need to list in the lease a separate amount for rent and a separate amount for utilities, or one lump sum? You can enter one lump sum, and then you need to specify the types of utilities that are included, but you don't have to sparse it out like so much for water, so much for pet fees, so much for utilities. You do not have to do that. It just needs to be clear. The rent is, for instance, $2,000, and that includes water, sewer, trash, pet fee, parking space, etc. How do we address a new move-in that starts tomorrow that signed a lease? Yeah, you have to change that, man. From March, the leases, rentals from March 1st need to adhere to the new system where rent includes all the utilities. No, pet deposits are part of the security deposits. And there's a new law coming in California that you can only charge 1 month rent as a security deposit. And whatever the security deposit that you're charging, that maximum amount should include the pet deposit. Okay, shall we go to the hand?
Hi, Selena, if you can unmute.
Oh, she answered my questions. Thank you. But I just wanted to comment that adding the pets, the parking, the storage, those are not considered utilities. So I'm still confused about that. And that's going to really change what market rates look like.
That's correct. And so they're not utilities, but they are housing services. And when you look in the CSFRA, it says all utilities and housing services are part of rent.
Thank you.
Kimberly, if you can unmute.
Yes,
We hear you.
I was wondering if we can now mandate that current residents sign a new rental agreement?
No, so you can ask for it, but tenants do not have to sign a new lease agreement under the CSFRA.
So how do you propose us sending, once the petition's approved for the one-time RUBS adjustment, how do you propose that becoming part of the agreement if you're not going to provide a lease addendum?
So that's going to be a rent increase form. And I understand the question, like then the lease agreement does not correctly reflect the language. So we have to come up with something that includes that language on the rent increase form, that where you use your utility adjustment, so that it's clear what is now included in the rent.
Okay, so we'll have to use your special form then to give that one-time RUBS adjustment with the rent.
Yeah, just like we now have a separate addendum, like a banked rent increase, we're probably going to make an addendum that you can use to explain the rent increase that you're giving to the tenants.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Anyone in the room?
That's a long question.
It's a lot of good.
Yeah, there's.
Any more questions? This is your time. And, we're going to repeat this workshop quite a few times. So feel free to log in later. Send your questions by email. We have office hours. We have the Landlord Help Center on Thursday afternoons. So there are ample opportunities for you to absorb this information and come back with any questions or concerns that you have. One more question? Yeah, so basically this is just like RUBS with your calculations. The initial calculation might look, it's kind of a system, just like RUBS uses, it's a different system, but you can only apply it once. Then it becomes part of rent, and the tenant pays the same amount over a period of 1 year without fluctuating utility billings. And yes, Jeff, we will send you copies of the slides.
We'll send copies of the slide to anybody who has registered online.
And so if someone wants an added housing service during the year, like an extra parking space, wants to do a pet, you can file a joint petition for the rent increase. And the process for that is also in the regulations. We'll do a separate workshop for joint petitions later in the year.
Is the, so sorry. Next question. So with follow-up question with regard to having storage or pet in the middle of the tenancy, is the landlord required to participate in the petition once the tenant petitioned to have a pet, let's say, for example, in the middle of the tenancy?
So if a tenant wants a pet, a joint petition means that the landlord and the tenant agree.
Okay.
Right? So if a landlord already does not agree because they have not a no pet policy, you don't have to participate in that, except when it's a service animal.
Well, it's not a pet.
Okay. I'm not that familiar. Yeah. Will there be limits to pet rent, parking, and storages? So all those housing services initially should go into your initially lease or rent agreement. And you as a landlord can set market rate or any rate that you think is reasonable for the rent and all these utilities and other housing services. Once it's in the rent, it's all considered rent, and it can be increased each year with the annual general adjustment. Do you need a petition to remove items from the lease, such as a pet or parking? That is a good question. And I think currently we don't have a process for that. So no, but we will definitely start thinking about that if that needs any guidance from the city or not. Does it mean that added housing services can only be added at the time of rent increases? No, you can file a joint petition anytime during the year. So we do proceed as normal for all existing tenants starting tomorrow and goes until the petition comes out in the summer. Correct. But if you're adding services mid-lease, does that go towards your annual allowable increase? No. If a joint petition is filed and approved, that can go on top of that existing rent, and then that increased rent is then subject to the AGA next year. Would the resident be allowed to decrease their rent if a pet storage parking is removed mid-lease? Yes. So in order to charge for a pet fee and pet deposit, it will have to be at the time of moving without having to file a petition. Correct. So another suggestion we may have is that in your lease, you could state if at any time you want to have a pet, there will be an additional amount of, I don't know, $100 added to the rent. So if you put those options in the rental agreement already, everybody knows what it means if they want added housing services. How can we file petitions if the forms are not available yet? Well, you can't. You have to wait until the second half of this year. Why wouldn't the implementation take effect once all the forms are available? Well, they will be implemented once the forms are available. Okay. This is the end of this presentation. One more last question. So we have 6 months from when the forms are available, or from 3/1. Okay, there are no forms available per March 1st. The only obligation landlords have per March 1st is to treat the new tenants with a rental agreement that includes the rent and includes all the utilities and housing services, and stipulate which type of services and utilities are included for new tenants. For existing tenants, you can keep going the way you do right now until the petition forms become available, and we will definitely let you know when they become available in the second half of this year. And from that time on, you have 6, 9, or 12 months to complete that process.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You used the word stakeholder earlier in the presentation. What is a stakeholder?
A stakeholder is anyone that is interested in this topic. For instance, we wanted to talk about RUBS and utilities, and we held a stakeholder meeting for landlords. So landlords is a stakeholder.
Stakeholders are land.
No, stakeholder is someone who's interested in the topic, which are landlords, but maybe also people that invest in real estate property. And we held a tenant meeting because tenants are also interested in this topic. So they were stakeholders as well.
Tenants are stakeholders,
Mhm.
landlords are stakeholders.
Yeah. And anyone else that is interested in the topic, they can come to those meetings.
Okay, yeah, because that's not, a stakeholder, I thought it meant somebody who had some skin in the game.
No,
That's not
well,
what it means.
tenants and landlords definitely.
Obviously, tenants and landlords do, but who else?
It doesn't matter, like, we are not checking whether or not you have a skin in the meat. Anybody who's interested to come to these public meetings.
Like somebody-
Yeah, anybody. Well, thank you all very much. This concludes the meeting, and we send you some follow-up documentation. Thank you all for your attendance.